So my name's Lindsay Sterling, and today I'm going to talk to you about the results of the recent excavation that we carried out on Church Street in Inverness. So I'll just begin by giving a quick background to the project, its location and a bit of history, and then I'll mostly spend the talk just summarising the main results of the excavation. And it's a very short talk, so it's going to be a rapid.
Oh, Lindsay, you've gone on mute. Can you? You gone on mute, or is there a problem? Does anyone know?
Okay, I was muted by someone else. Hopefully you can hear me now.
Speaker on. Oh, that's of course what it is.
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I can hear you now. Yep, you're okay.
Yep. Okay, so the excavation was part of a development project to build a new shop unit and flats within a narrow plot of land at 99 Church Street. And the site lay between some flats and shops and a hotel, and has the old Free North Church and the old High Church to the northwest side of it. And within the plot itself, there were some existing 19th century buildings which were demolished before the development took place. So Church Street, which was originally known as Kirkgate, is probably one of the earliest streets in the medieval town core of Inverness. And the original church is thought to have been founded in around about 1171 through a charter from William the Lion. And the street would have formed on the natural route between the castle and the church. And there was likely houses lining both sides of the street, with gardens going down to the river on one side, and then on the other side up towards the Old Foss boundary ditch, which is now roughly Academy Street. So early maps of the area, these ones from 18th century, tend to show buildings in the location of the development site. And it's likely that there was maybe buildings on the site even before these early maps. Later maps, we start getting a little bit more detail of the buildings on the site. So you can see the 1821 plan, there's 4 buildings shown there, and it's apparently owned by P. Anderson Esquire. And then the later OS Town Plan of 1867, you can see there's 5 main buildings on the site. And those buildings pretty much matched the footprint of what was then demolished during the development. So after the demolition of the buildings, AOC Archaeology came in to do an evaluation of the site, and we really quickly established that there was archaeological remains, and so we moved straight into a full excavation. The excavation was carried out from November until mid-January, with a break for Christmas and New Year.
Sorry, Lindsay, to interrupt. It doesn't look like your slides are moving forward. So it might be something with a share screen.
They're moving forward on my screen.
It could just be slow, but it's possible that have you got 2 screens, Lindsay? Is one showing the slideshow?
No, I just have one screen.
Okay, it may just be a slow connection.
You may need to make it full screen. It's not actually playing on the screen of what we're seeing. We're seeing the actual program rather than the actual PowerPoint itself.
Okay, well, on my screen, all I can see is a PowerPoint full screen.
We have had this issue in a previous talk. Try stop sharing and then go to sharing again, and instead of sharing the program, share your entire screen and then start the slideshow.
Okay. Okay, so hopefully you can see the whole screen now.
Yeah, that's working now.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. Okay, so where did I get to? Yeah, so we moved on to a full excavation, and this was carried out from mid-November until mid-January. And the digging conditions on site were really challenging for several reasons. Firstly, it's just a really narrow site plot, and so just finding spaces to put all of our soil and tools and things was really tricky. As been mentioned, it was the middle of the COVID pandemic, so we had to be really vigilant on all the health and safety. And then, of course, it was the middle of winter, so the weather was cold and wet, and you can even see a little bit of snow in some of the pictures there. The excavation area, we got split roughly into 4 areas, and we mainly just used the big post-medieval walls as the boundaries of these areas. And we dug a series of different sondages to begin with, and these eventually all got joined up. And then when we got to the medieval layers below, we had a series of different quadrants to help us with our sampling strategy. And then finally, when we got to the lowest levels of the site, we had to change strategy a bit because the excavation got so deep, we had to demolish some of the edges of the area just to make stepped edges. So we only had one narrow trench in the very base before we then brought in a machine to take away the last of the deposits. So the upper phase on the site was probably the post-medieval phase of occupation, and it was dominated by these substantial wall foundations that were across the site. There was also several pits and hearths and other features such as floor joists and middens. So the 18th to 19th century wall foundations were probably the most substantial feature visible on the site. And most of these walls were interconnected in some ways. And some of them went like really, really deep, and we had stepped foundations and evidence of 2 different foundation trench cuts. But in other places, the walls just seemed to sit right on top of the black earth. So there was a lot of differences in construction across the site. And there was a few places where we could see kind of the vertical breaks in the stonework where different walls had been joined onto each other. And it's clear that there's been a lot of modification of the buildings on this site over the last 200 years, right up to the modern concrete slabs that we found out the back of the site. We had 3 probable hearths in these buildings, and each one was quite different in style. And it's probable that they were in different parts of the buildings, and they may not have been contemporary. You can see the one in the top there has got a later wall cutting through the top of it, so that's likely the remains of an older hearth. And then we also had 2 separate sets of floor joists on different alignments, and these were likely showing the locations of different rooms or buildings in the complex. So between the post-medieval and the medieval phase, I have what I'm calling the transitional phase at the moment, and these are just features that didn't really sit clearly within the post-medieval structures, and then they were cutting through the earlier medieval features. So within this, we had 8 pits, and these were scattered across areas 1 and 2, and all of these cut into the medieval deposits below. And the deepest of these pits was pit 208, which you'll see on the left of the screen. And it had shells and bone in it, as well as occasional medieval ceramics, a possible quern fragment, and maybe a copper object. The lower fill was a lot more sterile, and it's led to the possible interpretation of this being like a clay or timber lined storage pit. Most of the other pits, it was really hard to tell what their function was, because they were all generally filled with really mixed material that contained medieval and post-medieval material. So it could be that they're kind of backfilling or debris from construction. There were lots of artifacts recovered from the upper layers across the site, and these included lots of post-medieval ceramics, lots of medieval ceramics. There was iron and other metal objects, glass, leather, clay pipes, stone discs, or pot lids as they're sometimes called. We had bone and ceramic spindle whorls and several coins as well. And the upper layers of the site had artifacts that seemed to come from a variety of different periods, and it probably suggests that these ground surfaces may have had medieval origins but have been modified and disturbed a lot during the post-medieval phase. So also in this transitional phase, we had a metalworking, specifically an ironworking area. And this was near the northeast end of the site, so quite near Church Street. And it was basically formed a spread of material that was really charcoal rich. It contained lots of hearth bases and iron slag and pieces of vitrified clay, which maybe suggests the presence of a furnace structure. And underneath this, there was a layer of gravel and some flat cobbles, and these may have been the original working surface. On either side of this area, we had 2 isolated post holes as well, and then a possible base of a rubble wall. And although we don't know for sure, but these may have been part of a small structure that was associated with metalworking. So directly underneath the post-medieval and the transitional features, we had the remains of a burnt down medieval building. And this building was set on the same alignment as the later post-medieval walls. And it suggests a real continuity of the plots along the street over time. So the medieval house was defined by 4 walls, each built with a double row of rounded cobbles bonded by clay. And along the northwest side of the building, we had 3 post holes. We had 1 at each corner and then 1 more in the centre. And these were built directly into the stonework itself. And we think there may have been post holes on the other side of the building, but it looks like the foundation trenches for the later post-medieval buildings have just clipped the edge of the wall, and that's probably why we didn't find anything along that side. So within the house, there were several very distinct layers, as you can hopefully see in some of these pictures. So the upper deposit was a really bright orange burnt clay and daub, and this was directly on top of a really dark black charcoal rich layer, and it had high quantities of burnt withies and fibrous material and large burnt timbers. And both of these layers appeared to spread over the top of the walls and some of it outside the back of the building. And it's likely that these were the collapsed roof and wall materials from a wattle and daub building. Below this, we had deposit 290, which we were interpreting as probably the main occupation or floor layer of the building. And it was a really reddish, yellowy brown, silty clay. It had lots of charcoal flecks and animal bone and shell fragments in it. And there was also a couple of discrete deposits on the surface. I think probably the most notable one was a pad of clay near the centre of the northwest side that may have been an entrance location to the building. Again, we had quite a lot of artefacts coming from the medieval house. Most of them were medieval ceramic fragments, including several jug handles and lots of just small pieces of pottery. One of the prettiest finds we had on the site was the carved bone pin, which also came from this layer. We also had some iron and copper objects, which will need more analysis to be able to tell what they are. And then also there's one ceramic spindle whorl from just outside the house, which was one of 5 that we had across the site. So out the back of the house, we had what looked like the remains of a bank and ditch feature. So the bank lay up against the outside face of the house, and it's possible that the house itself was built into the bank. And then the ditch was just beyond that, and it was 2.5 meters wide and up to 1.3 meters deep. But that was after we'd had to remove one of the post-medieval walls, which was directly on top of it. So it could have been a lot deeper. And the ditch had several fills within it, so it may have had quite a long period of use throughout the medieval period. So moving on to the next phase, below the medieval house, we had the remains of several earlier features and deposits, including ditches, large pits, alignments of post holes. And I think probably the most intriguing part of the site is at the northeast end near Church Street. We had a really large area that had been cut well into the subsoil, and it just seemed to be filled with lots of mixed layers of medieval construction debris. But most interestingly, it had a really well preserved stone wall lining one edge of it. So this is the area that I'm talking about. So the deposits here were significantly deeper than elsewhere on site. And it was a kind of a really large hollowed out cut area. And I think we had three sides of this feature, but it looked like more of the deposits continued outside the site on the northwest side. And the wall that you can see there, we think was probably a revetment wall into the ditch or boundary on that side of the feature, because one face of it was much taller and much more neatly built than the back side of it. So within this really area of really deep deposits, we had several layers of mixed and collapsed, probably structural material, all of which was lying up against the northeast face of the wall. And these included a thick band of burnt daub and clay, and there was also distinct charcoal lines within this, and this was all on top of just kind of mixed infill layers that had daub, clay, charcoal, burnt timbers, and stones. So as I mentioned earlier, we only had a very narrow snapshot into these layers, and while we couldn't necessarily identify a structure like we had above, it's possible that this is like construction debris from an earlier building that was in this location. Again, we had lots of artifacts from these layers right down to the very base of the site. Again, the majority of these were medieval ceramics, but in this part of the site, there was noticeable differences in the style. We still had bits of the classic kind of red fabric pottery with the green glaze, but we also had lots more pieces of Scottish white gritty ware, which is generally thought to be a much earlier date of pottery. So it's possible that some of these layers could be as early as the 12th century. And some of the other artifacts from these levels included a silver coin, a small copper disc, there was some iron nails and other metal objects, and also several more of these stone discs or pot lids. So the other early features near the base of the site, we had 2 further ditches, 5 large pits, and also 2 alignments of post holes. And these were all cut into the subsoil across the site. The 2 ditches, they ran roughly parallel with plot edges, so they might have been earlier boundary ditches. Several of the large pits that we found, they were all rather inconveniently located underneath the post-medieval walls, which meant it was really hard to actually get in to excavate them. But we have one that you can see on the screen there in the centre. That was probably the biggest of the pits, and it just cuts into the edge of one of the ditches, and there was midden material at the bottom of this ditch and pit. And that contained shell, bone, medieval ceramics, as well as some copper objects, and that other carved bone pin that you can see on the screen there. And then also in area 3, which is at the back of the site, we had 2 alignments of post holes that are possibly the remains of old boundary fences or something similar. So to summarise, the excavations can be split roughly into 4 phases of activity. We had the post-medieval phase with big wall foundations, hearths, floors and middens. We had a transitional phase of various pits and post holes and an ironworking area. Then below that we have the medieval phase, where we had the almost complete remains of a wattle and daub building. And then finally the early phase, which had deep medieval deposits, as well as ditches, pits and post holes. So what's next for the project? Well, the fieldwork stage of the project is now complete, and if anyone has been down Church Street, you'll see the new buildings are well underway to being constructed. As of yet, our findings can only be loosely placed in the history of Inverness, but it seems likely that the site has suffered at least 2 burning events, one which collapsed the upper wattle and daub structure, and then possibly an earlier event associated with the deeper layers on site. And Documentary evidence of Inverness history indicates that Inverness has been captured and burnt several times throughout the late 12th century up to the 15th century. So it's possible that these burning events may link to one of those, or equally, they could just be the result of accidental fire. So the next stage for the project is to begin the post-excavation analysis, and this will likely include environmental processing of our samples. There'll be specialist artifact research and conservation, and hopefully we'll get some good radiocarbon dates to help tie down the specific dates for the different phases. And hopefully all of this together will give us a better understanding of the function and status of the building and the different phases, which hopefully then we can lead to comparisons with other medieval sites in Inverness, such as Castle Street excavations by Jonathan Wordsworth, or things like the medieval Cromarty Borough project by Mary Peteranna and Steve Birch. So just to finish, I want to say thanks to all the people who made the project possible. So thanks to our clients at Arc Estates, Colin Armstrong Architects and the Highland Council. Big thanks to IBI joiners for their practical help on site, especially to Ross and Rowan, who did a lot of wheelbarrowing for us. Thanks to Kirsty Cameron for her advice throughout the excavation. And then finally, thanks to everyone involved in the excavation team.